You know, it's funny how often faith, or even just like the idea of belief, pops up in conversations these days.
Yeah, definitely.
It's in the news, it's in the shows we watch. I mean, it even comes up in casual talks. So today,
It's everywhere.
yeah, totally. So we're going to dive into this article. It's got a pretty strong title, you know. It's called Christians Are Being Silenced. But
And get your attention.
yeah, for sure. But before everyone starts like jumping to conclusions, just remember,
Right.
we're just here to see what this article's about.
Unpack it a little.
Exactly. Not pick sides or anything.
Absolutely. What I find interesting, though, is how this article, it kind of shows this tension. A lot of people feel it, you know, like society's changing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of clashing with what they believe deep down. So whether you agree with the article or not, like, it's important to try and get where they're coming from.
For sure. Okay, so let's break it down. They start off talking about this cultural shift
Okay.
towards secularism
Mm.
and pluralism.
Mm.
And they even use the example of how media often presents a more secular worldview,
Right.
almost making it seem like traditional Christian values are like out of place.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and that ties into this bigger shift, right, towards individualism. Like, the article seems to be saying that this whole individual choice thing, it can make it harder for Christians to really live out their faith openly because it clashes with that traditional sense of community, you know?
Right. Right.
And then on top of that, you've got changing demographics.
Yeah.
More people now than ever saying they're not religious. So you put all that together, and yeah, you're going to have some cultural clashes.
Exactly. And speaking of cultural clashes, they talk about how some Christians feel like they have to like hide their faith just to fit in.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they mention how people react to things like public prayer
Mm.
or religious symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole push to keep that stuff out of like shared spaces,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you wonder, like, is there even room for that anymore?
It's a good question. And it kind of throws us right into the whole debate about separating church and state, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's a whole other, I mean, historically, different countries have approached that in completely different ways.
Yeah.
Some places, they've got an official state religion, and then you've got other countries that are, like, firmly secular.
Right.
And it raises a big question. How do you balance, like, individual rights to express your religion? Yeah.
With the impact that might have on other people,
Mm.
especially in a society where everyone's got different beliefs, you know?
Totally.
It's a tough one. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. Like, how do you find that balance?
Exactly.
Moving on, the article gets into politics, and they seem worried about laws that they feel are, like, limiting religious expression. Like, they bring up restricting prayer in schools.
Right.
Or censoring religious content in public places.
And that, again, that's something with like centuries of history behind it. This whole relationship between like religion and government, it's
Yeah.
always been complicated.
Yeah.
You know, it's this back and forth,
For sure.
two powerful forces.
Right. Always kind of like pushing and pulling, and it shapes everything. The way societies work. It's important to look at these legal battles, you know, what they really mean
Mhm.
and how they're playing out around the world, because it's not simple.
It's definitely not black and white. Okay, so this next one, this one really got me thinking.
Okay.
Media representation. The article claims that Christians are often shown in a negative light.
Interesting.
Yeah, like they focus on the extremists, you know, or they paint this picture of Christians being like stuck in the past,
Yeah.
out of touch with today's world.
Mm.
And it actually made me think of, well, you know, mention a specific show movie.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I don't know if you've seen it, but
I've heard of it.
it really makes you think about how media portrays like certain groups, you know?
It does. It's interesting they bring that up because it makes you think about media literacy in general.
Right.
How important that is these days. Because the way stories are told, what they choose to focus on, what they leave out,
Right.
it all shapes how we see the world, you know? And there's a big difference between actually depicting a group of people accurately
Right.
versus just playing up these harmful stereotypes that already exist.
Totally.
Makes you think about all the shows, all the movies you've seen.
Right.
Have any of them, like, tackled this whole faith thing in a way that felt fair?
Yeah.
Or, you know, the opposite, like really stereotypical?
It makes you realize how much power media has
It really does. Huge influence.
to shape our views on like entire groups of people.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of media's influence, they go on to talk about social media
Okay.
and how it's kind of a a double-edged sword for Christians, you know?
Oh, so.
Like on one hand, it's a place to connect, find community.
Right.
But then on the other hand, it can also be this breeding ground for like negativity and intolerance. Like they even mentioned cancel culture,
Yeah, that's real.
where if someone expresses a belief that's seen as, I don't know, out of line, they get slammed for it. This whole social media thing is fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
You've got the potential for connection, community.
Right.
But then there's this other side, the negativity, the intolerance.
Yeah, and what's important to remember is that the very nature of online spaces, it shapes how we behave.
Right.
So on the one hand, you can have these amazing connections. You know, you're exposed to different viewpoints, different ways of life. But then on the other hand, it can also make intolerance so much worse.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's almost impossible to have a nuanced conversation online.
Right.
It's not just about religion either. I think we all struggle with that a little.
Oh, definitely.
Have you ever, like, thought twice before posting something? Like, maybe you were worried about what people would say?
All the time.
Especially about something sensitive. It's a real concern these days.
It really is. Now, get ready for this next part because it gets kind of deep.
Okay.
They call it the moral relativism conundrum.
Whoa.
It sounds complicated, but
It does.
it's basically saying that if everyone gets to decide what's right and wrong just for themselves,
Okay.
it clashes with this idea that there are, like, absolute truths, you know?
Right.
They specifically mention how, like, views on sexuality and family are changing, and it's causing tension. It's like, we've all heard that saying, you do you.
Right.
But what happens when your you bumps up against someone else's?
Yeah.
It gets messy.
It does. And, you know, this article really shines a light on those pressure points
Yeah.
where people are feeling that friction. You know, society's changing so fast.
It's a lot.
And it can feel like the ground's constantly shifting under your feet. This whole moral relativism idea that there's no one right answer,
Right.
it can be really hard for people who find comfort in a fixed set of beliefs.
Totally. And on that note, they bring up the very real issue of persecution that Christians face in some parts of the world.
Yeah.
And they're not talking about, like, feeling a little awkward or whatever.
Mm.
They mean real danger,
Right.
real oppression.
And that's where it's so important to be careful about where we're getting our information from.
Absolutely.
You know, persecution based on someone's religion, it's a horrible reality in a lot of places.
Mhm.
But it can also be twisted, you know,
Yeah.
exaggerated, sometimes for political reasons. So it's about context. You have to understand the history of a region, the politics,
Right.
all of it, to really be able to say, okay, what's really going on here?
For sure. It reminds us that freedom of religion, something we often take for granted.
Absolutely.
It's not a given everywhere.
Not at all.
Okay, changing gears a little bit.
Okay.
They then talk about education
Ah,
and how it's become this, like, battleground of ideas.
interesting.
The article's worried about secular ideologies basically taking over some schools and universities, making it hard for Christian students and teachers to, you know, voice their opinions, to speak your truth.
And that brings up a huge question. What is the role of religion in education? I mean, should public schools, for example, be totally neutral when it comes to faith?
Right.
Or is there a way to acknowledge that faith is important to a lot of people, to society as a whole, without saying one belief system is better than another?
Right.
It's about finding that balance again.
Right. Like, how do we make sure different perspectives are allowed in schools and universities
Exactly.
while also protecting academic freedom?
It's a tough one, for sure.
It seems like with all this stuff, it always comes back to finding that balance.
It really does, and it just shows how complex these issues are. It's not like there's one easy answer, you know?
Not at all. So their last point, this
Okay.
one's about community. And they basically say that those traditional, like, religious communities, they're shrinking.
Interesting.
Yeah, they say it's partly because it's this whole individualism thing,
Right.
but also they say technology plays a role. Like, we're replacing real face-to-face connection
Right.
with screens. It makes you wonder, are we trading those deep relationships
For sure.
for something, I don't know, kind of surface level?
That's a great point. And, you know, that's not just true for religious groups, is it?
Right.
This whole way we build communities, the way we connect with each other,
Yeah.
it's changing so fast because of technology. Like, we've got more ways to reach out than ever before, right? Social media, texting, all that. But it makes you think, are we really connecting? It's a big question. A lot of researchers are even looking into that right now. Like, what's the difference between those online communities
Yeah.
and the ones you have in person?
Right.
Because you can actually feel lonely even when you're like super connected online. It's kind of wild.
That's so true.
Oh,
So where does all this leave us? I mean, we've covered a ton today.
we have.
Cultural shifts, political pressures, how media portrays things, the impact of technology. We even got into some deep stuff about morality, truth.
Yeah.
I got to say, this deep dive really got me thinking.
What's really stood out to me is just how connected everything is.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you can't talk about these challenges that, Christians are saying they're facing
Right.
without also looking at the bigger picture. All the social stuff, the tech stuff, even just how we think about the world, philosophically, it's all woven together. And if we want to have any kind of real talk about this stuff, we got to see those connections.
That's a really good point. And that's what I love about these deep dives, It's not about telling you what to think.
Exactly.
It's about giving you the information, the different sides of it, so you can figure it out for yourself. That's what matters.
I couldn't agree more. And honestly, if you're left with more questions than you started with,
Yeah.
that's a good sign. Means you're really thinking about it. You're being critical. And that's what we want to encourage,
For sure. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm
Yeah.
curious, what stuck with you?
Yeah. What will you take away from this whole discussion about the challenges that Christians are facing? How does it change how you see things? Not just about faith, but about all the big changes happening in society.
It's a lot to think about. Definitely something to chew on for a while. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a whole new topic. It's like we've been saying the whole time.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with something this complex. There's no magic solution, no one size fits all.
Exactly. It's more about asking the right questions than getting all the answers. And this article, it really makes you do that.
It definitely does. It shines a light on all this tension, all the challenges people are facing.
Yeah, and it's not just about faith either, right? I mean, we talked about how it connects to these bigger changes that are affecting everyone, no matter what you believe.
It's true. It's like we're all part of this big changing world, just trying to figure it out as we go.
Isn't that the truth? So we're wrapping up this deep dive on the challenges facing Christians today, and I'm left thinking.
What will you take away from it all? Like,
Yeah.
what really stuck with you? What will you keep thinking about?
So many things. We covered a lot. Cultural shifts, politics, media representation, tech, even those big philosophical questions about right and wrong.
And the important thing is you don't have to agree with everything. Just try to understand where people are coming from, engage with the ideas.
Exactly. And if you're curious to learn more, that's great. Do some more digging on your own.
Read, listen to different perspectives.
Most importantly, don't stop asking questions.
Couldn't agree more. Because in a world with so much information,
Oh, I know it.
critical thinking, empathy,
So important.
more important than ever.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time for another one.